And welcome to Galaxy Moonbeam Night Site. We are the retro talk program for nostalgia and baby boomer stuff right here on the Galaxy Nostalgia Network. I'm Smitty.
I'm Mike.
And I'm George.
And we welcome you to our program. We're so happy to have you with us today. We are all here. The Galaxy Gang is all here, and we have a great show for you. We're going to talk about an iconic personality and an iconic television program of the past that I'm sure all of you remember, and I'm sure our younger listeners have heard of. Let's start by giving you a little bit of music and see if you can figure out what we're talking about here. Yes, of course, The Tonight Show, but not The Tonight Show that we have on now. We're talking about The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, an American institution for many, many years. And let's toss it over to our good buddy Mike Bragg. And Mike, you've got some good thoughts, and you're going to lead us in on this because there's a lot of neat stuff to talk about here.
Well, thank you, Smitty. And speaking of Johnny Carson, let it be known that we as baby boomers and our parents know as Johnny Carson, the man who tucked America into bed every night, Monday through Friday. Johnny Carson, the leader, the undisputed king of late-night talk. There's never been anyone, in my opinion, even a bit close to matching the talent and the sustainability and the credibility of Johnny Carson. And the reason we're bringing this show together, actually, we're producing this show. We are in the middle of January 2016. And there's a reason we're doing that, because something interesting happened. Something very unnecessary, but we're talking talk shows. And 11 o'clock at night, I would watch the news all the way up until recently, all my growing up years, and then at 11:30 I would watch Johnny Carson. Well, 11:30 I don't have Johnny Carson anymore, but then again I do because of the nostalgia TV stations that have come out. Antenna, MeTV, Cozy. They brought Johnny Carson reruns back starting earlier in January around New Year's. You can catch the Johnny Carson episodes. Most of them appear to be from the late 70s and early 80s. I saw one the other night with Robert Blake, and gosh, he looks like a young guy, and he was up there pitching Beretta. So whatever, I guess early 80s, whenever that was. But Johnny Carson, small-town Midwestern guy, makes good, and good he made. And not only did he make good, but he made a lot of people real good. A lot of people followed in his footsteps. A short list could go on and on. David Brenner, Ellen DeGeneres, and on. Joan Rivers.
Jay Leno.
Yeah, on and on. But we can talk about Johnny Carson. This could be easily a 5 or 6 hour show, Smitty and George, but we're going to unfortunately have a half-hour show today. But the other reason we wanted to bring this show up, and you'll probably be hearing it a month or two down the road from now, but Johnny Carson left us. He passed away 10 years ago this month. George, does it seem like 10 years ago?
I wonder where the time has gone. I think because I think about Johnny Carson, and as we talked about during the pre-production sequence, he cast a long shadow that went beyond not only when he left the video waves 20 years ago, but it continues 10 years after his passing. And as you noted, because of these rebroadcasts, it seems like he never left.
You know what, I was just going to think and say that because I was too young to remember the first Johnny Carson show, but I was tuned in on his last show with Bette Midler. And I wept, too. I cried.
I think we all did, Mike.
You had to.
Yeah.
It was the end of an era.
It was an end of a very big piece in the puzzle known as American pop culture.
Very much so.
To watch him say goodnight, and still with the class and elan and integrity that carried him so many years from the very night he took over from Jack Parr. His style was almost Ed Sullivan meets Arthur Godfrey. Down home, he could talk to the people. He could make fun of whatever political side of the aisle you were on. He would take jabs at both sides. He had some of his favorites that he would bring out almost on a regular basis. Not that he didn't like them, but they brought a lot of laughs and they brought a lot of fan mail, and they kept the man on the air. Now, this is something, George, right around re-election time, and I remember in the 70s, even late 60s, he would always start saying how he was nominating Earl Stassen for president.
Harold Stassen.
Oh, Earl Stassen. Or maybe Harold Stassen. Harold Stassen. Thank you, George. It was not George Stassen. But Mr. Stassen was an American political figure way back from the 30s and 40s, actually in the FDR era.
And he always was running for president.
He was the perennial candidate. He was known as the perennial candidate.
Always there.
And Johnny Carson, he made big laughs with, and our next guest, if he were alive, would be none other than Harold Stassen, our candidate for the independent, and he would run with that every time there was an election. You would tune in to want to hear what Johnny Carson would say about Harold Stassen.
And what I remember about Carson is that he had famous figures from the political world, and the one that comes to mind is the one when he had Richard Nixon in 1963. Now, you have to remember that Nixon had lost the 1960 election to John Kennedy. Then he lost the gubernatorial race to Pat Brown in 62, and he gave his famous speech, "Won't have Nixon to kick around." He appears on Carson's show in 63. They have an engaging conversation, and I remember seeing the video where Carson asks Nixon, well, do you think Kennedy's got a chance to win election again in 1964? And his comment was, which one? Because at that time, all of the Kennedy brothers held a political office, and Carson had a really sharp wit and an ability to really enhance his guests. In fact, I think that's what's so amazing about Johnny Carson is we not only remember, as you noted, Mike, his class, his elan, his style, but the guests that he had on over the many decades that also were a highlight and a hallmark of excellence on that show.
Well, true, George, and what a showman. Even when he didn't have big-name guests, he would create his own guests that were none other than himself. A couple of them, and you remember these over history, Floyd R. Turbo, the guy in the plaid hunting jacket with the duck hat.
Of course,
with the duck hat, yes, of course.
And he would make these real tongue-in-cheek quotes that were probably just borderline of the FCC coming down and writing a fat ticket to NBC. But he'd get away with them because he was Johnny Carson. Aunt Blabby. I don't even remember Aunt Blabby. She was the cantankerous old lady. And
oh, yes.
She would goof on Ed McMahon. El Moldo was the mentalist. He would see visions of things. He would have answers for questions that weren't even asked. The Maharishi. He could make the weather as a guest on The Tonight Show. It was so hot in Burbank today, and what would the crowd say?
How hot was it?
You would just be beaming to wait for how hot it was in Burbank, because he'd come up with something. It was so hot today, Raymond Burr was selling shade for 50 cents a square foot.
Yeah, he could hit you hard.
And he could hurt somebody, but also he could
make you laugh.
He could tell dog jokes. It was so hot today in Burbank that I saw a fire hydrant chasing a dog. And just the way he could deliver, and he was always so almost meek and embarrassed that he cracked a joke, and he would look over at the audience like, that one didn't work, huh?
And he was always very stylish in his manner of dress.
Yes, the sport coats.
I mean, if you look at the way he dressed, it reflects every decade, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. I mean, it's kind of fun. You just look at that it reflects the styles of the day.
Well, basically, Johnny Carson, again, American pop culture, and our pop culture and shows like this is basically television. We grew up, the television, there were no computers.
Right.
There was no texting. You had TV, and in our home you had the radio, and those were the only two forms other than the newspaper to get your information. Now, Sunday nights was Ed Sullivan. Johnny Carson was the heir apparent to Ed Sullivan. As Ed Sullivan, the Ed Sullivan Show entered its waning days of popularity, Johnny Carson made a televised talk version of the Ed Sullivan Show. Had Ed Sullivan been a talk show host instead of a vaudeville showman, it would have fit the profile of the Tonight Show. Bring in guests, talk about it. The acts would come out. Johnny Carson had tap dancers on that would come out. He'd
have the people with the spinning plates.
It was a variety show.
Yeah, it was a variety show. Yeah,
he was amazing. But what I think about Carson as well, when you talk about it being part of our lives, I also viewed Carson as sort of being a rite of passage. Because as you got older and you were allowed to stay up late at night, keep in mind that when we grew up, there were no VCRs.
None.
There was no DVRs.
And there were school nights.
And you had to go to bed at a certain time to meet curfew because you had school the next morning. So I remember that when you got old enough to be able to stay up late to watch the Carson show as it aired live, then that basically was an indication that you had reached adulthood. And of course, I always thought that was neat because it was also an opportunity to share a moment with your parents. Because what I remember is being able to watch that show with my parents. So it's something that we could do together. Yeah. And of course, because of the variety nature show of Carson's content, I was able to watch, for example, Buddy Rich, who, yours truly being a drummer, I loved it because it turns out that Buddy Rich was the most frequent guest on Johnny Carson over the years. And then, of course, you come to find out that Johnny Carson himself was a most competent and efficient drummer.
Yes, he was.
Mm-hmm. And so to be able to see this and to enjoy it with your parents, it was sort of like a mark of sophistication. Again, a rite of passage. And I think another aspect is that when Carson shifted his venue from New York City to Burbank, California, my hometown, and also the hometown of our good friend Peggy,
that's right.
That really marked the bi-coastal aspect.
The bi-coastal.
Because
he was originally in New York, wasn't he?
Yes, because my uncle
during the Jack Parr, the transition.
My uncle Jim Halalakos, I'm named after his father. When he first came out to California, one of the things he wanted to do is he wanted to go on the Carson show. He goes, I never got a chance to do it when he was in New York City, so I made sure that I got tickets for Uncle Jim, and they were able to go see the Carson show. And that actually became one of my favorite things to do when we would have out-of-town guests, was to always get them tickets for the Carson show. We were well connected with some people that allowed us to do that, and it was fun. Yours truly, I never went to a taping, but I always was happy to get tickets for those that did.
Well, Toluca Lake. What can you say about Toluca Lake? Peggy,
Bob's Big
Boy.
Peggy, I know you're out there listening. I'm going to share one. And thank goodness for Peggy. She just posted a picture of the A&W root beer. How many times have we been there, George? The one in Burbank?
So many times, right there near Buena Vista.
Well, my mom and dad would take us out to that one. It was the closest one from Highland Park, and we would have to go to Burbank. And they were looking for a travel trailer at the time. There was a place called the Iowa Farm Boys. But first, we would go get a Papa Burger.
Yeah,
A&W. I forgot
Papa Burger and Mama Burger.
But you would get the real mugs at A&W.
Absolutely,
you had to turn them in.
And what was funny about it is that when Carson moved to Burbank, then suddenly all of the things that we as local residents had, well, I wouldn't say took for granted, but we knew about it. Suddenly, people around the country knew about it. I have to tell you, Carson, when he was on the cover of the City of Burbank telephone book,
right?
That, I don't know how many multiple printings, and that became an important collectible.
Well, as with the photo of Johnny Carson at the A&W Root Beer, I remember that visit, and I would not have remembered that except we were researching the Johnny Carson, and Peggy sent that photo up on Facebook, and I thought, we're doing a Johnny Carson? Whoa, wait a minute, because between that and I will tell my Johnny Carson story in a moment, but between A&W Root Beer, Winchell's Donuts, and on Riverside Drive, yes, and Bob's Big
Boy.
Johnny Carson would frequent all three of those places.
Yes, he would. And what ended up happening was the photographs and like the Burbank phone book and anything with Carson connected with Burbank, they became collectibles. I found myself, and as did my parents, we would get those as Christmas gifts and give them to people as Christmas gifts, rather, to our relatives in Texas or to New York and elsewhere. My goodness, you could not believe what a difference that made. And Carson just had that presence that brought the whole country together.
There was a gas station, and it was called Wilshire Gas. Wilshire, I'll never forget it. It had nothing to do with Wilshire Boulevard, but there was a Wilshire gas station on Western Avenue in Burbank.
Yes.
And my grandfather and I would go out there every January because the Wilshire gas station would give out new calendars, wall calendars, that my grandparents would put on the back porch, and they always had Johnny Carson.
Amazing.
On the Wilshire gasoline station wall calendars, and I wish I could find one of those. Those would bring back so many memories.
Wow, yeah.
But my Johnny Carson story happens to do with Bob's Big Boy. And it was counter service then. I don't know if it is now. There's still a Bob's Big Boy there.
Yes, there's still counter service.
But there's counter service, and I walked in, and Johnny Carson would tape at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Johnny Carson liked to drive Corvette Stingrays. My buddy and I were going out. We were doing something in Burbank. I forgot. Oh, Mort's Surplus. That's for another story.
Oh, another show idea.
We would buy fake bombs. But anyway, that's a Johnny Carson bit. I'll share that one later. But Johnny Carson was sitting at the counter at about 1 o'clock one afternoon, and he had a donut. He was eating a donut, and he was eating it with a fork. And he had a cup of coffee and a donut, and obviously he was coming down, and I think it was probably dessert, but he had a donut. It was like, I would never forget this. And he was cutting it with a fork, and my buddy, Mark, said, I got a gag for him. You think he'll buy it? And I go, what? You bought the donut. I said, go try it. No, it's Johnny Carson. You try it. No. Well, anyway, he went up there and said, Mr. Carson, how are you? Good. And Carson's looking down. He wouldn't look at you. He's looking down. He's cutting this donut and eating with a fork. He goes, I bet you use a fork to cut the donut because you always dull the knives with them here. And Carson said, kid, go back to school. Because he goes, donut jokes don't fly on the West Coast. And I'll never forget that. He was being serious. He was being Johnny Carson in a Bob's Big Boy at a counter seat.
Wow. In any venue, Carson was the master of the put down.
Yeah.
And it was done with courtesy, but it was also done with firmness.
With firmness and
style.
It's almost like, scram, kids, I'm having my donut, but at the same time, I'm going to crack a joke, and at the third time, and I'm going to dump it on you. You're going to be the foil. And it was beautiful. And you don't forget that stuff. You're a 17-year-old kid, and it's like, guess who we saw at Bob's? You don't remember. You just got dissed by the most famous man on TV. But it was wonderful, and it was a magic moment.
It is a magic moment, and the thing that's interesting about Carson, just to show you the kind of pull and the power he has, you didn't even have to be there, and he could still have a dramatic impact with the put-down.
Well, and he could hurt you, too.
Well, I recall...
Ask Raymond Burr.
Well, I was thinking, for example, of Barbra Streisand. Barbra Streisand had already been a Grammy Award winner, an Academy Award winner, and she was scheduled to make an appearance on one of his programs. I don't recall the reason why she had to cancel, but what ended up happening was you didn't do that to Johnny because it was a last-minute cancellation. So apparently what he did is that he hired an imitator of Barbra Streisand. That person came out, started to sing something from one of the movies that she had done in the 60s, and immediately Carson had the hook and said, okay, Barbra, that's enough from you. I mean, basically it was sort of a little shot saying...
I remember that episode.
We're done with you, Barbra. We're done with you.
And he smirked, and basically he was giving her the kiss of death.
Exactly right.
Yes.
And that's the thing about Carson is he could either make you or break you. I know that a lot of the people who appeared said that when they finished their song, finished their monologue, if Carson invited you to come over and sit down next to him at the desk, you had arrived.
Yeah.
You were accepted. You were in. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, kind of what you just described, George, when something like that happened, that was the kiss of death.
But and there was a pecking order, too, Smitty.
Yes.
It's good you brought that up because there was a pecking order at the chairs.
Yes.
He would two things. Number one, thank you, and he'd applaud, and you'd go back behind the curtain and be relegated to obscurity. Or he would wave you in, and he'd point to the chair. And if you were Robert Blake or a number of people, he would point to the first chair. And that means, basically, how would we say it? You've been anointed.
You've been anointed.
Yes.
And the thing that is interesting, though, is that you also, even if you were a guest, you had to be careful not to overshadow the host. Because Carson had a great deal of insecurity about that. Unlike, for example, Jack Benny, who had supreme self-confidence and was allowing himself to be the foil or was glad to step back because he always knew it was his show. The case in point that I remember was in the mid-1970s when Jerry Brown was in his first go-around as governor in California and was at that time, a nationally known political figure. He had a friendship with rock star Linda Ronstadt and so forth. He appeared on The Carson Show. And, of course, Jerry Brown, no matter what you think of him, he's a great conversationalist. He's very witty. He can capture a crowd with his charisma. And his appearance on The Carson Show apparently made such an impression that Johnny was literally invisible. Jerry had sort of basically taken over the show. And I guess this sort of got back to Carson because not long afterwards, Carson enlisted the help of Betty White, Yes, the same Betty White that's in her 90s now and still popular on TV. And what they did is they did a spoof of Jerry Brown. And, of course, Carson portrayed the role of Jerry Brown, dressed, with the trademark hairstyle and so forth. And Betty White was Linda Ronstadt on roller skates. And it was a real acerbic but hard-hitting put-down of Jerry Brown. And it was sort of a reminder that, hey, you may have done well on this show, but guess what? It's my show, and it has my name on it. And I guess that was sort of the difference, is that Carson, was one that was not afraid to show those insecurities.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Well, so true. I mean, it's somebody that can actually offend Mr. Rogers is somebody that would have the power to, and that somebody was Johnny Carson. He did a bit one time where he did a very evil, mean-spirited version of Mr. Rogers on one of his skits, where he told the audience, the kids in the audience, now tonight when your mom and dad go to sleep, get in your mom's purse or get in your dad's wallet and get some money and send it so we can keep this show going. While Fred Rogers was just, he was horrified and incensed and quite noticeably angry, and probably quite rightfully so, and expressed that. Johnny Carson, in one of the few occasions, actually did a publicized apology to Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, apologizing for that skit and for going a little bit over the line. There's another side to that. After the apology, suddenly underwriters started pulling their support for Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Is that right?
Was that the influence of Johnny? We don't know, but they said it was far beyond and above coincidence where Johnny could break you financially. We'll talk real quick, and then are we going to do a retromercial?
Yes, we will. Mm-hmm.
When we get back from the retromercial, we're going to talk about Wayne Newton.
Ah, yes.
And Johnny Carson. And the wonder years of doing battle on the Strip of Las Vegas. Coming right back, we're going to do a retromercial. Don't go away. You're right here on the Galaxy Moonbeam Night Site on the Galaxy Nostalgia Network.
Move, make the move.
How do you follow a great car with a great car? With Chrysler 1970.
Chrysler, your next car is Chrysler. Your next car is here today.
Chrysler 1970. Your next car. The car built for the age of motion. The car that moves you in style and comfort and luxury. The car that comes from a long line of engineering greats, now so beautifully conceived. The more you see it, the more you want it.
Welcome back to Galaxy Moonbeam Night Site here on the Galaxy Nostalgia Network. I'm Gilbert Smitty Smith, along with my good buddies George Halilakos and Mike Bragg. We're talking about an American institution that we all grew up with, The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. And, of course, this is coming about 10 years, just a little more than 10 years after the passing of Johnny Carson. And The Tonight Show, was already in place when Johnny Carson took over. First originally hosted by Steve Allen, then Jack Parr, and then Johnny Carson took over for his long run from 1962 through 1992. And first 10 years were from New York, the following from Burbank, California. And we're talking about Johnny Carson, remembering a lot of the things about him. And Mike, you had some more thoughts about Johnny and particularly his issues that he had with Wayne Newton, among others. So take it away.
Well, Johnny Carson could make a career or break a career. He could also get you in your wallet, but he could also get his feelings hurt and hold grudges. As a wonderful entertainer as he was a human being, and we all succumb to the frailties of being a human being. But one of the most notable feuds in the Johnny Carson career was that with Wayne Newton. Wayne Newton, of course, the popular Vegas entertainer. In 1980, they both went after the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas to attempt to purchase it. Wayne Newton and Johnny went on a bidding war, and Wayne Newton just wanted the hotel so bad that Johnny Carson backed out and took it personal, and from that moment on, told pretty bad things about Wayne Newton, got quite mean-spirited, but Johnny didn't like to lose. Two things Johnny didn't like: disloyalty, a la what happened with Joan Rivers, and somebody besting him to where he had to go away the loser. But Johnny Carson, since he was the king, if you would apologize to him, he would erase the slate. Joan Rivers made the mistake of never apologizing. Wayne Newton, on the other hand, contacted Johnny privately, and they made peace and worked it out. And the horrible Wayne Newton, not horrible, they were part of his Johnny Carson, but the Wayne Newton jokes stopped. And they were really getting to Wayne Newton and affecting his career. Also, and I'm going to toss over to George because we're running out of showtime here, but I'm going to tell you how Johnny Carson could create a national frenzy. I don't know if you remember the one episode where Johnny Carson mentioned in the news today, they're anticipating a shortage of toilet paper over the summer. Toilet paper, you better start stocking up on toilet paper, and there are some people already known to be hoarding the shelves, and the shelves are starting to empty. And he was making a joke. It was so effective. It was almost like our Orson Welles, War of the Worlds.
Exactly, yeah.
The next 2 days, there was a national shortage of toilet paper because everybody was buying 5 cases apiece and putting them in their garage. Johnny Carson had to do a retraction, which, of course, he turned into a bit. But you look up the toilet paper controversy in Johnny Carson, you might get a laugh at how this man could actually modify the news of the day. He could create a current event that was not there. That's an entertainer. George, you have some closing thoughts, and Gilbert, and then we're going to get out of here. But what an interesting show. We could have gone an hour on this.
Easily.
2 quick memories, both unrelated. The first one, funniest moment, had to be when Ed Ames, who was playing a lead character on the Daniel Boone series in the late 60s, appeared on Johnny Carson, and there was the tomahawk throwing scene, and that just elicited a great amount of laughter that is still remembered to this day. I would encourage the Galaxy Nostalgia audience to go on YouTube and look up Ed Ames, Johnny Carson. You'll see what I mean. It's visual humor. But on a more serious note, I think we've talked about the dark side of Johnny Carson, which we all have a dark side, but Johnny Carson also had a soft side. And it was rather poignant when his son was killed in a freak accident. And I recall when Mr. Carson, in a very rare personal moment of vulnerability, took a few moments to pay tribute to his son on national TV and showing some of the work that his son had done. I believe his son was a photographer and an artist, and it was rather poignant in which he was able to express the sorrow that all of us feel when we lose a loved one, particularly a close family member. And I think it was a rare show of vulnerability that really, I think, showed another side to Mr. Carson that further endeared him to his audience, both nationally and worldwide. And that's, for me, a moment that will always stand as one of my most notable moments, as well as, of course, the final episode that Mike noted with Bette Midler.
Well, in closing, I'm just going to wrap up. Johnny Carson and economists and other societal professionals have agreed and done a study. Here we go with the studies. But Johnny Carson was one of the reasons that American households acquired second television sets in their homes. It was because of Johnny Carson, because you would get the second TV for mom and dad to put in the bedroom so they could get in bed, get in their pajamas, and get in bed and go to sleep with Johnny Carson. Believe it or not, it's true.
Very much so. And I think it was immortalized on several network TV shows that referenced that. You know, oh, we're going to watch the Carson show and turn in.
And he did skits of creating his own trend, because he did several skits. I forgot with Carol Burnett or who it was, where he's in the king-size bed with his wife, who I forgot who it was now. Maybe it was Anne Margaret. But they have the TV on the rack above the dresser, and they're making comments about the Johnny Carson show. And it's one of the most memorable. Hopefully it'll come up on MeTV or Antenna or whoever's running it. Gilbert, we're about out of time.
We're about
buddy.
out of time.
And I'm getting hoarse. Can you...
I can take over.
Can you ride this horse out of here?
I can ride this horse out of here. I just wanted to mention real quick, there was an anniversary show that Johnny Carson did. I forget what it was. And when they opened the curtain up, they rolled him out in a bed. And he said, I'm doing this show from bed, because that's where most of you watch this show.
That's it.
Remarkable.
Yeah, very good.
Anyway, Johnny Carson and The Tonight Show, an American institution that we all remember, and certainly if you have any memories of watching Johnny Carson late night and The Tonight Show, we want to hear from you. Our email address is galaxymoonbeamnightsite@gmail.com, galaxymoonbeamnightsite@gmail.com. Our website is galaxymoonbeamnightsite.com. Don't forget, on our website, our good buddy Mike Bragg has just improved the accessibility to all of our shows. Our entire library is available there, and you can access all of our shows from show 1 to our latest show. And don't forget, our good buddy George Halakos posts a wonderful blog page every month. So when you go on our webpage, look for the George Halakos tab and click on it. You'll see some great memories that George shares with us. Our Facebook page, Galaxy Moonbeam Night Site page on Facebook, and our shows are all available on Mixcloud and on iTunes for your listening pleasure. And that's all the time we have on this program. We thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, I'm Smitty.
I'm Mike.
And I'm George.
And we thank you for joining us on this episode of Galaxy Moonbeam Night Site on the Galaxy Nostalgia Network. This is the Galaxy Nostalgia Network.